So first of all, I wanted to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about some of the topics that I'm working on recently. This is my first time in Beijing, first time in China. I've been here 10 days. I think I can say that I kind of fell in love with this country. This is a great country, and I look forward to coming back. So, and you know, you're very welcoming. So, thank you for organizing this side talk. I know that there's a big conference going on. There was another conference, so, and your own vacation. So, thank you for coming. All right. So, as was said before, I'm interested in the issue of the origins of concepts and knowledge. And this is, of course, a question which goes back to Plato, Aristotle, and through the modern period, Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, and contemporary philosophy, right? So, especially in the 90s, 1990, there was like a resurgence of, as you know, so towards 1950, with Chomsky's critique of Skinner's behaviorism, you know, most psychology and cognitive scientists turned nativists. But recently, there was like a resurgence of interest in empiricism. That is the view that there's not really much which is innate in our mind. At most, there are some learning capabilities which are inborn, but most of what we learn, most of what we know, we learn and we acquire from experience, from looking around, from talking to people. So, for example, and recently, there's as late as 2009, there was a book published by a very prominent psychologist, Susan Carey, on the origin of concepts. This is just to tell you just how important this debate still is, although I'm going to talk primarily about Locke and Descartes. You'll see I have quotations also from Susan Carey, who was a psychologist at Harvard, and Randy Gallister and Rochelle Gelman, who work at Rutgers University, and they're psychologists, cognitive psychologists. So, so I've been told to give the talk first and then take questions, but if at any point you want to interrupt me and ask a question, a clarificatory questions about any of the issues discussed, I'll be happy to stop and talk about it. And if there are translation issues, I can get some help. All right. So as you should know from my name, I'm actually not American myself. So I have to learn English myself. So English is my second language also, so I understand. All right. So I think there's no question that Locke's arguments against nativism. So John Locke is this British philosopher who wrote the essay concerning human understanding in 1690. Right? He made this he gave this very prominent arguments against nativism, and everybody recognizes that these are very important arguments. The question is, why are they important? Why are we still thinking about them? And are they really undermining the opposite view, the nativist view? So this is another philosopher, Fiona Cowie, who in 1999 wrote what was a very influential book, saying she was taking the side of Locke, and she argued that Locke's arguments actually have established that insofar as the nativist has a plausible answer to the genetic question, that is the question how we acquire ideas, the answer is indistinguishable from the empiricist. And you'll see the argument. So essentially, she buys into Locke's argument that the only plausible version of nativism that we could possibly have is not strong enough, and it collapses into empiricism, and therefore there's no way to defend nativism. And other commentators say that Locke's criticism is right because essentially he's attacking the notion of implicit knowledge. So if there's any epistemologists here in this crowd, you can tell me, obviously, this is not only Descartes' problem, it's just really hard to unpack the notion of implicit knowledge. But so, and insofar as Locke was attacking this notion, people argued that his arguments were successful against innatism, because innatism, at least in Descartes' version of it, implies the presence of implicit knowledge in the mind. Well, what I want to argue instead is that these criticisms are incorrect. There is a way for Descartes to save his version of nativism, but I don't want to undermine the force of Locke's arguments, and I will conclude that Locke's lasting contribution to the debate on concept acquisition consists in raising awareness of the necessity, not only for nativists like Descartes, but for even contemporary nativists, to be clear about the nature of the postulated hidden structure of thought. Should it or should it not be couched in intentional terms? What we see both in the early modern period and in the contemporary literature, both in philosophy and in psychology, is that the innateness hypothesis is spelled out in at least two different ways. One which is more cognitive, intentional, innate knowledge, and one is not cognitive, like the presence of some domain-specific learning mechanism or innate constraints on what we can know. So it's not a cognitive way of spelling out the hypothesis. Okay, let me just go on. So, and this is how I will proceed. So first, I will lay out the variety of nativism that Descartes holds, and that we can see present in the contemporary literature also. Second, I will present Locke's arguments as they occur in the first book of the essay. Three, I'll proceed to evaluate these arguments and defend my conclusions that I already anticipated, that they do not undermine this position on nativism. And I conclude with a discussion of what I take to be Locke's and timeless contribution to this debate. And in fact, I hope that you'll be pleased by my conclusion, because that's the beginning of my research project. But if that doesn't work, then I'm in trouble. Okay, so in Descartes and Leibniz, and as I said, in the contemporary literature, you see the innateness hypothesis spelled out in different ways. And so I will just go over what these different ways are first. So first of all, I think everybody agrees that the nativism that Locke was opposing is a so-called dispositional nativism. So obviously, nobody has ever argued that children or anybody is born thinking, knowing the Pythagorean theorem, or that 2 + 2 = 4. Nobody has ever, argued for that, or knowing what agent means, or knowing what object means. So if you're committed to the nativist hypothesis, you've got to say something slightly different. So there's that innate ideas are ideas that one is born with the disposition to form under appropriate circumstances. Now, of course, this is vague enough that you can cash it out in many different ways. So there are at least 3 different forms of dispositional nativism. One is a Platonist version of it. Just think of the fiddle. I mean, if you don't have it present, just don't worry about it. But so famously, Plato thought that all knowledge is recollection. So that learning is just recollecting what you had learned before. So there's a strong nativism there. So one way of spelling out this dispositional nativism is in the Platonist way, saying that an innate idea of X is an idea that the mind has the ability to recollect on the occasion of encounters with examples of the concept or instances of the concept as something that one explicitly knew before birth. So the famous example is, of Plato is the example of equality. So when I'm actually learning what two equal sticks are, I'm not really learning this from experience, but I am recollecting. So in that sense, I'm born predisposed to understand this because I knew this already. And I knew that I knew in a previous life. But although there's a very small passage in Descartes which seems to endorse this view, this is not the Cartesian view, because Descartes didn't believe that the soul pre-existed the body. He's not a Platonist in this way. So this is how he describes his dispositional nativism. I apply the term innate. This is from a passage from the comments on the certain broadsheet, which is like a reply that a former student of his, Regius, had written some criticisms of Descartes, and Descartes wrote this. Regius, or Regius, and this is and Descartes wrote this pamphlet. So this former student had written this pamphlet, critical pamphlet, and Descartes replied in this work. So Descartes says, I apply the term innate to ideas in the same sense in which we say that generosity is innate in certain families, so that certain diseases such as gout or stones are innate in others. It's not so much that the babies of such families suffer from these diseases in their mother's womb, but simply that they are born with a certain faculty or tendency to contract them later in life. So this is obviously an endorsement of dispositional nativism. But there are two ways of spelling out this dispositional nativism, which you find in different texts in Descartes. One is what I call cognitive dispositional nativism, according to which an innate idea of X is an idea which the mind has the disposition to become aware of later in life on the occasion of encounters with X. And this disposition is grounded in implicit knowledge of these ideas in the mind, without this implicit knowledge being the remainder of an earlier explicit knowledge. So innate ideas are ideas just implicitly present in the mind, right? So the difference with Plato is that in the case of Platonic dispositional nativism, the disposition is grounded on explicit knowledge. Whereas in this case, because you don't have a previous state that the soul has lived in, so you may think, Descartes is a dualist, he doesn't know how well it works, but when the mind is born, it's got these ideas in the mind, and then later on, when you see something in the environment, that knowledge of that which was implicit may come to the surface. That's the model. So that's what I call cognitive dispositional nativism, and it entails the notion of implicit knowledge. What that exactly means, that's a big question. But right. So this is some textual evidence that Descartes believes that, but I don't want to. But there is one passage which I should tell you, so that that in the second meditation, Descartes makes the famous argument cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And that's supposed to be the first item of knowledge. But then in another work, The Principles, he had said that you actually cannot have knowledge of that unless you had knowledge of the proposition, the general proposition, the I who thinks exists, or existence and thought. So Berman, who interviewed Descartes, I'd asked him, so is this a contradiction? And Descartes' answer is this: before this inference, I am thinking, therefore I exist, the major whatever things exist can be known, for it is in reality prior to my inference, and my inference depends on it. That is why the author says in The Principles of Philosophy that the major premise comes first, namely because implicitly it is always presupposed and prior, but it does not follow that I'm always expressly and explicitly aware of this priority. So here, although this is a translation, I checked the Latin and it corresponds. So he makes this explicit, sorry, the pun of words, distinction between implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. Right? So he's definitely committed to this. But there's a different way. In other parts of Descartes is not always consistent. A lot of philosophers aren't. Well, lots of psychologists and linguists aren't. I mean, he also spells out the innateness hypothesis in a different way, which is not very cognitive. He really talks, it seems as though he's talking about innate capacities, innate abilities. So according to this understanding of dispositional nativism, or non-cognitive dispositional nativism, an innate idea is an idea that the mind is specifically predisposed in the sense of specifically structured to acquire under appropriate circumstances. This disposition is not grounded in either implicit or explicit knowledge. So this disposition, just think about, Fodor's sensory input analyzers. So the mind is predisposed to produce a certain concepts on the appearance of certain experiences, but there's no learning there. So that's what I mean by domain-specific learning mechanisms, acquisition mechanisms. So that a certain idea is produced, is created, so it's not known before on the occasion of certain experiences that we have, but there's no learning involved. And therefore, the conclusion is that it's innate. There is a bunch of textual evidence that supports this reading of Descartes. First of all, the quote you read before where he compares innate ideas to innate diseases, but I'll skip most of I'll stay focused on the arguments, and then if there are questions about the text, we can go back. So, the next question I want to address is this, right? Does any of these forms of dispositional nativism defy Locke critique? So the next thing we should do is just to look at Locke's critique. Any questions so far? No? Should I go on and then take questions at the end? Any clarificatory questions? Can I go on, or am I speaking too fast? Yes. Okay, I'll try to speak more slowly. I'm just worried about going on for 2 hours, but but it's better for you to understand and then stay here a little longer than. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That's what I'm asking. Okay, so far we talked about the different forms of nativism that, by the way, I should say that this is not just Descartes. So for example, I just read recently Susan Carey's book on the origins of knowledge. This is a a woman psychologist who teaches at Harvard. And she has published this book on, it's like this thick, it's like 500 pages. And I'm teaching a graduate seminar on concepts, so during the summer we read it. And when she's a nativist, she believes that there are some concepts, she calls them core cognition concepts, which are innate. And you'll see, if you, even in this contemporary literature, you see sometimes she talks about knowing principles. She doesn't talk about implicit principles, but so there's some principles that the mind knows, like agency, for example. She believes that we have mathematical principles and principles that talk about, the intentional agent. And sometimes she talks about constraints and just mechanisms which are innate. So this is an ambiguity which is pervasive. It's not just in Descartes. So, and Locke, I think that was right in pointing to this ambiguity, and that's how he does it. So this is just a reconstruction of his argument. So Locke, he wrote this essay Forever, right? But it was first published in 1690, and it's like a treatise on the cognitive faculties. So it's just starting from sensory perception to belief and knowledge of the most abstract entities. And in the first book, in chapter 2, he gives this argument against nativism. And so the argument goes like this. This is the skeletal reconstruction of the argument. So he said, okay, if you're a nativist, nativism, or the view that there are innate ideas in the mind, is either one of the following two claims. So you can read the nativist position in either one of two ways. One, A, is that one is born being aware or knowing these ideas. So there is a specific ideas that you know. Or B, one is born with the capacity to develop the so-called innate idea. But premise 2, A is false, right? He says, because we're not born thinking 2 + 2 = 4. So nativism must be reduced to B, right? That one is born with the capacity to develop these ideas. But he says, if nativism is really equivalent to B, then B really collapses into empiricism, because that's what an empiricist would never deny, that we have the capacity to learn what we learn, right? After all, I always tell my students, we're different from rocks and desks. We learn stuff. We must be predisposed to learn it, right? But that's all the empiricists would concede. But Locke wants to say that if nativism comes down to B, then it collapses into empiricism. It's no different from any empiricist hypothesis. Therefore, devastating conclusion, either nativism is false or it is not distinguishable from empiricism. So at best, nativists should be empiricists. So a nativism is either doesn't make any sense, the nativist hypothesis, or it collapses into empiricism. That's the basic structure of the argument. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, I am going to look at how Locke argues against A and B. So I'm looking at the arguments by which he attacks first cognitive and then non-cognitive disposition of nativism. See if this argument is correct then. So here's one thing which I always found, which is very obvious, but which I find very puzzling in Locke. Locke is committed to what I called in an old paper that I published, old, 2004. It's not that old, but he's committed to this principle that I call A, the awareness principle, that an idea is in the mind. So you can say that an idea is in the mind only if you're aware of it, which doesn't seem to make any sense, right? But look, that's exactly what he says. He says it is a contradiction to say that there are truths imprinted on the soul, which he perceives or understands not. Imprinting. So he really thinks of innate idea as being like imprinted on the mind, right? And he says, if they're imprinted in the mind, you got to know them. If you say that you don't know them, you're not aware of them, then they're not in the mind. That's what the awareness principle says. An idea is in the mind only if the mind is aware of it. Well, as you can say, if you commit to this principle, then of course the notion of implicit knowledge becomes impossible, right? Because an idea which is implicit in the mind is an idea that the mind is not aware of, need not be aware of, and may never be aware of. It's something which sits there. It's like, think of Chomsky's, well, maybe former Chomsky, knowledge of genetic grammar, right? It's deeply there. You may not even be able to access it, but it's there. So, but if you're committed to the awareness principle, the notion of implicit knowledge doesn't make any sense. So that's how, so he essentially rejects, Locke rejects the cognitive version of nativism, because the cognitive version of nativism implies commitment to implicit knowledge, and because of his awareness principle, he cannot make sense of the notion of implicit knowledge himself. Things are a little more complicated, though. I want to do full justice to Locke, so you have to bear with me on like a little. It's not a digression. It's part of the argument. It's a little more complicated because, of course, Locke knows that. Who wouldn't, right? Who believes that? Do you believe that you cannot have ideas in the mind you're not aware of? Do you believe that there could be ideas in your mind you're not aware of at this moment? Does when I teach this stuff, my students raise their hands immediately and go like, what? That's impossible. Right? You think you have memories? Right? There are lots of things that you've known in the past, you've learned in the past. Boy, I wish. I studied 5 years of Greek, ancient Greek, in high school. I wish it was already like this. I wasn't aware of it now. No, it sits there. But I'm not aware of it, right? So Locke knows there are ideas of memory those are ideas you're not currently aware of, right? They're there, right? And in fact, he has a section on habitual knowledge. So a nativist could tell him, look, you agree that there's a class of ideas, that is, ideas of memories, which are in the mind, but you're not aware of, right? So couldn't innate ideas be like that, right? So you have the theoretical apparatus for that. Well, then Leibniz especially. You know, Leibniz wrote a new essay responding paragraph by paragraph to Locke. But Locke was a smart man, right? He wouldn't make this simple mistake. So he's got a very specific notion of memory, which I'm sure some of you will not agree of. And there are studies of, you know, in psychology of memory that I wish I was more up to speed with, and maybe some of you can tell me about them.